Donald Trump, you might want to leave black women alone. And America, hashtag, we tried to tell you. We told you this man was a fraud. We told you he was a con artist. Today, New York State Attorney General Letitia James laid bare how fraudulent Donald Trump has been when it comes to overstating, overvaluing his assets, even lying about the size of his own apartment in Trump Tower. Folks, in a 22-minute speech, AG James just laid bare how grossly Donald Trump has essentially stolen from banks when it came to valuing his company, and she wants massive changes with today's announcement of this civil lawsuit.
Following a comprehensive 3-year investigation by my office, including witnesses, interviews with more than 65 witnesses, and review of millions of documents that were submitted by Mr. Trump and others, I am announcing that today we are filing a lawsuit against Donald Trump for violating the law as part of his efforts to generate profits for himself, his family, and his company. The complaint demonstrates that Donald Trump falsely inflated his net worth by billions of dollars to unjustly enrich himself and to cheat the system, thereby cheating all of us. He did this with the help of the other defendants, his children, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, and Eric Trump, and former Trump Organization CFO Alan Weisselberg and Trump Organization Controller Jeffrey McConney. Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization repeatedly and persistently manipulated the value of assets to induce banks to lend money to the Trump Organization on more favorable terms than would otherwise have been available to the company, to pay lower taxes, to satisfy continuing loan agreements, and to induce insurance companies to provide insurance coverage for higher limits and at lower premiums. This conduct was all in violation of Executive Law, Section 6312, which gives the Attorney General broad and special powers to go after persistent and repeated fraud and illegality. As part of demonstrating illegality under that section of Law 6312, we show that they violated several state criminal laws, including falsifying business records, issuing false financial statements, insurance fraud, and engaging in a conspiracy to commit each of these state law violations. We believe the conduct alleged in this action also violates federal criminal law, including issuing false statements to financial institutions and bank fraud. And we are referring those criminal violations that we've uncovered to the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York and the Internal Revenue Service. As a result of these violations, we are asking the court to, among other things, permanently bar Mr. Trump, Donald Trump Jr., Ivanka Trump, Eric Trump, from serving as an officer or director in any corporation or similar entity registered and or licensed in New York. To bar Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization from entering into any New York State commercial real estate acquisition or from applying for loans from any financial institution in New York for 5 years. To pay for the financial benefits obtained as a result of the persistent fraudulent practices at an estimated $250 million. And towards the end of my remarks, I will go into the other relief that we are seeking. At the center of the year-long financial scheme were the statements of financial condition that were prepared annually by and for Mr. Trump, specifically from 2011 to 2021, These statements were compiled by the Trump Organization executives and were issued as a compilation report by Mr. Trump's accounting firm. The statements are explicit that the preparation was the responsibility of Mr. Trump. Or starting in 2016, the trustees of his trust, Donald Trump Jr. and Alan Weisselberg, for the sole benefit of Mr. Donald Trump. Each statement was personally certified as accurate by Mr. Trump or by one of his trustees as part of the loan process, with the intent that the information in the statement would be relied upon by banks and insurers. Mr. Trump and Mr. Weisselberg would meet to review and approve the final statement every year. Mr. Trump made known through Alan Weisselberg that he wanted his net worth reflected on the statements to increase, a desire Mr. Weisselberg and others carried out year after year in their fraudulent preparation of the statements. And when asked about these meetings under oath as part of our deposition, both men, Mr. Trump and Mr. Weisselberg, invoked their Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination, and they refused to answer. When asked under oath if he, Mr. Trump, continued to review and approve the statements after becoming President of the United States in 2017, Mr. Trump, again, invoked his Fifth Amendment privilege and refused to answer. Over the course of our investigation, we found that Mr. Trump, his children, the Trump Organization, created and used more than 200 false and misleading asset valuations on his statement of financial condition over that 10-year period. They issued statements that were in clear violation of general accepted principles in the general accounting principles in the United States, despite representing that these statements were prepared in accordance with these principles. Some of the common tactics they used include representing that Mr. Trump had cash on hand that he did not have, ignoring critical restrictions that would significantly impact property values when setting valuations, changing the methodology used to value properties from year to year without reason or notice, and using vastly different methods to value different properties even in the same year, and including tangible items such as brand premiums, the Trump premium, when calculating an asset's value, despite the fact that they ignored the advice of outside professionals. They also ignored the advice and appraisals of outside professionals, despite claiming those individuals provided certain figures. For example, they received a series of bank-ordered appraisals for the commercial property at 40 Wall Street in New York City that calculated the value of the property at $200 million as of August 2010. And $220 million as of November 2012. Yet, in his 2011 statement, Mr. Trump listed 40 Wall Street with a value of $524 million, which increased to $530 million over the next 2 years, more than twice the value calculated by the professionals. Even more egregious, the $500 million plus valuation was attributed to information from the appraiser who valued the building at just over $200 million. Another deceptive strategy they employed was to use objectively false numbers to calculate property values. Take Mr. Trump's triplex. You know, the triplex apartment in Trump Tower on Fifth Avenue? Mr. Trump represented that his apartment spanned more than 30,000 square feet, which was the basis for valuing the apartment. In reality, the apartment had an area of less than 11,000 square feet, something that Mr. Trump was well aware of. And based on that inflated square footage, the value of the apartment in 2015 and 2016 was $327 million. To this date, no apartment in New York City has ever sold for close to that amount. Tripling the size of the apartment for purposes of the valuation was intentional and deliberate fraud, not an honest mistake. Mr. Trump was intimately familiar with the layout of both the building and the apartment, having personally overseen the construction of both. Despite his sworn testimony before invoking his Fifth Amendment privilege, Mr. Weisselberg conceded that using the false square footage improperly inflated the value of the apartment almost threefold. Mr. Weisselberg admitted that this amounted to an overstatement of, give or take, $200 million. Misrepresenting the size of the apartment was only one of the many ways that Mr. Trump intentionally misvalued his asset for the purposes of increasing his net worth and inducing banks to offer more favorable terms. Mr. Trump also routinely ignored legal restrictions on development rights and marketability on properties that would significantly decrease property values. For example, let's take Trump Park Avenue in New York. This building contains both commercial and residential space. The unsold residential condo units owned by Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization represented the lion's share of the reported value for this property. Mr. Trump and his children intentionally ignored legal restrictions on some of the units that would have drastically changed the valuation. Specifically, the 12 of those units were actually rent-stabilized apartments. A professional appraiser valued those 12 units at around $750,000, noting that the rent-stabilized units cannot be marketed as individual units for sale because the current tenants cannot be forced to leave. Despite this professional valuation, and Mr. Trump knowing full well the legal restrictions the 12 rent-stabilized units were valued, he valued them collectively on his statements at $49 million. That is about 65 times the appraised valuation. Mr. Trump also blatantly ignored legal restrictions at Mar-a-Lago. Mar-a-Lago was valued on the false premise that it sat on unrestricted property and could be developed for residential use. However, Mr. Trump knew that Mar-a-Lago was subject to a host of onerous restrictions and limitations. Mr. Trump himself signed deeds sharply restricting changes to the property and donating his residential development rights in an effort to get a tax deduction and later to lower his property taxes on the property. The deeds also require Mr. Trump to donate over 23% of Mar-a-Lago's value to the Historic Trust for Historic Preservation if he ever sold it. Despite these significant restrictions, Mr. Trump valued the property based on the false premise that it was an unrestricted residential 18-acre plot of land that could be sold and used as a private home. In fact, the valuations represent that these restrictions don't even exist. The club generated annual revenues of less than $25 million and should have been valued at about $75 million. However, Mar-a-Lago was valued as high as $739 million. Mr. Trump used inappropriate schemes to inflate the value of his other golf clubs. He valued the clubs based on their fixed assets. In other words, the money spent to acquire and to maintain them, despite being informed by valuation professionals that this practice was inappropriate for a club operating as an ongoing business. He again added a brand premium when determining the value of the club, but claimed in his statements that he did not. And he inflated the value of unsold memberships, often by hundreds of thousands of dollars per membership, even in situations where the memberships were given away for free at Mr. Trump's direction. Inflating his reported net worth was just the first part of the scheme. He then used these false statements of financial condition for his own personal gain. Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization have obtained hundreds of millions of dollars in real estate loans and insurance coverage using these statements. Mr. Trump was able to secure much more favorable loan terms by personally guaranteeing the loans based on his reported net worth, as reflected on his statements of financial condition. These statements were key, integral to Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization's ability to secure loans for a number of properties, including the old post office in Washington, D.C. Mr. Trump's statements were first submitted to the federal government to demonstrate his financial status, his net worth. He then engaged with Deutsche Bank to obtain a loan to redevelop the property. Mr. Trump was able to obtain much more favorable loan terms by personally guaranteeing the loans. So in 2014, he secured a loan from Deutsche Bank for $170 million. And as you know, in May of 22, Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization, they sold the post office, the old post office property, for $375 million, resulting in a $100 million net profit, which was the result of a loan he was able to obtain through the use of false and misleading statements of financial condition. Separately, Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization saved an estimated $150 million by receiving favorable interest rates that were only provided based on the false and misleading statements of financial condition. We also believe that he illegally saved millions of dollars in federal tax benefits, conservation easement donations related to Seven Springs in Westchester and the Trump National Golf Club in Los Angeles. And this conduct is not the subject of this action, but we are referring it to the IRS and to the Southern District of New York. The examples I laid out just barely scratch the surface of the misconduct that we have uncovered. The complaint, which all of you should have a copy, is more than 280 pages long. It includes examples from 23 assets that were grossly and fraudulently inflated, and those inflated values were used on Mr. Trump's statements almost every year. All told, we uncovered more than 200 examples of false and misleading asset valuations that were used on his statements. The pattern of fraud and deception that was used by Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization for their own financial benefit is astounding. Inflating the values of assets by whatever means necessary to increase Mr. Trump's purported net worth. And then that net worth was used to further enhance his financial standing, intentionally misrepresenting his financials to obtain incredible economic benefit. It was a scheme that, by its very nature, became more profitable over time. And it is all in stark violation of the law. As I mentioned earlier, the relief that we are seeking specifically, we are asking the court, again, to permanently bar Mr. Trump, Donald Trump, Eric Trump, Ivanka Trump from serving as an officer or director in any corporation or similar business entity registered or licensed in New York State. We are barring Mr. Trump and his organization from entering into any New York State commercial real estate acquisition for 5 years. We are barring Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization from applying for any loans from any financial institution registered with the New York Department of Financial Services for 5 years. We are requiring Mr. Trump and the Trump Organization to disgorge the financial benefits obtained through the persistent fraudulent practices, a baseline at the minimum of $250 million, and to appoint an independent monitor at the Trump Organization to oversee compliance, financial reporting, evaluations, and disclosures to lenders, insurers, and tax authorities for no less than 5 years. We are requiring the Trump Organization to prepare on an annual basis for the next 5 years a GAAP, a generally accepted accounting practices compliant audited statement of financial condition showing Mr. Trump's net worth to be distributed to all the recipients of his prior statements of financial condition. To replace the current trustees of the Donald J. Trump Revocable Trust with new independent trustees, or require similar independent governance if a new trust is created, and to permanently bar Alan Weisselberg and Jeffrey McConney from serving in the financial control of any New York corporation. And lastly, to cancel any certificate filed under and by virtue of the provisions of Section 130 of the General Business Law for the corporate entities named as defendants and any other entity controlled by or beneficially owned by Donald Trump, which participated in or benefited from the ongoing financial scheme. In other words, permanently prohibit any of these companies from doing business in the state of New York. I want to be clear. White-collar financial crime is not a victimless crime. When the well-connected break the law to take in more money that they are entitled to, it reduces resources to working people, to regular people, to small businesses, and to all taxpayers. Everyday people cannot lie to a bank about how much money they have in order to get a favorable loan to buy a home or to send their kid to college. And if they did, the government would throw the book at them. Why should this be any different? It is a tale of two justice systems, one for everyday working people and one for the elite, the rich and the powerful. Mr. Trump and his allies may say that these penalties are too harsh or that this is part of a witch hunt. I will remind everyone that this investigation only started after Michael Cohen, his former lawyer, testified before Congress and shed light on this misconduct. And the remedies are consistent with what we have sought for other businesses that committed the same misconduct. This investigation revealed that Donald Trump engaged in years of illegal conduct to inflate his net worth, to deceive banks and the people of the great state of New York. Claiming you have money that you do not have does not amount to the art of the deal. It's the art of the steal. And there cannot be different rules for different people in this country or in this state. And former presidents are no different. And so today we are making good on that promise, on our commitment, because no one is above the law.
Joining us right now, Robert Patillo. He is the executive director for the Rainbow Push Coalition Peachtree Street Project. Monique Presley will be joining us a little bit later, legal analyst and host. Make It Make Sense with Monique Presley. Dr. Larry J. Walker, assistant professor, University of Central Florida. All right, Robert, let's walk through this. Detailed, specific, numerous allegations. Already, of course, Donald Trump, he's called her racist. This is a witch hunt. Bill Barr has been on Fox News saying, oh, my God, you know, she's going after the children. This is just so unfair. But, Robert, people need to understand, when you lie on a loan application, you are committing a federal crime. That's why she said she's referred these things to the Department of Justice and the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Absolutely. And just to take the Bill Barr statement first, all of Donald Trump's kids are older than me. Everybody except for Barron. So Ivanka, I think, is 40. Don Jr. is 44. Eric is 38. These are grown-ass people. And this idea, this infantilization of wealthy white people, this idea that they're just kids acting up, they have no idea what is going on, that is just outside the purview of what I think most Americans understand. I think it's almost a ridiculous argument that former AG Barr was making. On this point about the Trump Organization, remember, this is the same president that said we have to have law and order in this country country when it came to black protesters. These are the same people who were running around chanting, lock her up, because of emails. When in reality, what we do know is that the millionaire and billionaire class in this country, just as Bernie Sanders and Reverend Jetson's been saying for the last 50 years, they play by a different set of rules than the rest of us. The rest of us, if we lie on a loan application or a credit card application, we can face years in prison. Letitia James isn't even talking about jail time. This is a civil suit in this case. She's referring it to the federal government for further prosecution for potential criminal charges. But what we have seen is they have been brazen in the nature of this fraud to the point that President Trump, when interviewed, did not even offer a defense. He pled the fifth for 4 straight hours. He did not answer a single question, meaning, and if he had really thought that he had any ability to counter these charges, these accusations, he could have done so at any point in time. Now, I think this is a point that most people need to understand in regular business. If you're at your job and the CFO either resigns or pleads guilty to a crime, things really bad are about to happen because that's the person in charge of the book. So when we saw Weisselberg be charged and then take a plea deal in the case, we knew that it would not be long until we saw something along this lines coming down. And Letitia James has been very judicious in trying this outside of the court of public opinion, not making a spectacle about it, going about this work for years on end. There were many calls for this before the 2020 election for them to bring these types of charges to help politically. She did not do that. She went through the process. She interviewed hundreds of witnesses, reviewed thousands of pages of documents, took dozens of depositions in order to reach this conclusion. It's not a conclusion which is reached lightly because there is this charge that the Trump base, about half, or probably 40% of this country, will believe that any sort of accusations against President Trump are a politically motivated witch hunt. They will believe that any sorts of prosecution against Trump is about the deep state, the loony liberal, something along those lines. They cannot accept the fact that they supported and still do support a career criminal who has inflated his assets, who has built this cult of personality around the idea, the concept of having a lot of money without actually having a lot of money. I think also if you dive into these documents, I had a chance to jump into some of the publicly available documents earlier and not do a full deep dive, but at a certain level of wealth in this country, money becomes completely imaginary. You take some money, you take out loans on that money to pay off the next amount of money. You show fake assets on paper to take out additional loans, which then justifies you getting more loans. So you're basically taking one credit card to pay off the next credit card, and nobody asks you about it because they assume you have money somewhere down the line. And apparently you can pull this hustle off an entire career. And if President Trump had never entered public life, they probably will still be running this hustle in New York right now.
Larry, it is laughable to look at these Trump supporters, and I said this when he had Trump Hotel in D.C. I'm like, you broke ass folks, they wouldn't even let you walk through the lobby. He is the embodiment of a con man, and these folks are defending it. Oh, this is a partisan witch hunt. No. They got the goods on him. And the fact of the matter is, it was well known in New York he was a fraud. But the New York tabloids loved him, the media ate it up, and national media ate it up, and people were unwilling to truly look at what he was doing. It was a house of cards. And now it's come crumbling down, and guess what? It's now time to pay the piper.
So this is the story of chickens come home to roost. You know, you're right, Roland. We know for years that, he's been running this con for decades. But this kind of reminds me of when you're a kid in elementary, middle school, and there's a bully in the cafeteria who's always pushing kids around. And then finally somebody stands up to him. So this is that moment for Donald Trump and his family. Listen, let's be clear. She's going for the corporate death penalty in terms of the fines and the other guidelines she outlined in terms of owning property in the city. So this could very well be the end. Obviously, Roland, we didn't even talk about all the other challenges in Georgia and the federal government investigation and January 6th, all the other challenges that Donald Trump is dealing with. But this is significant because we've been waiting for months to find out what A.G. James was going to do in terms of addressing all these fraudulent claims we know have been reported in the Washington Post, New York Times, et cetera. So that day is finally here. You hit on a very important point, is that how the media in many respects have fed this narrative about this bigger than life, corporate business entity. But we know now not only, like I said, from some of the articles we talked about, but we know from what the AG had to say today that he's all a fraud. Inflating his worth by hundreds of millions of dollars. This is not only in terms of the IRS, but obviously she referred to the DOJ. But these penalties, not only for the Trump, but for this family, are significant. And this could very well mean the very end of the Trump organization. And I know no one will shed tears about it. I certainly won't. But it's finally we're seeing people holding Trump accountable for the lies and all the other ways in which he's manipulated the system over the last several decades, because he's getting away with it that long. But finally, once again, chickens have come home to roost. And like I said, this could be the death knell for the Trump organization.
Monique, when you look at the critics, when you look at the folks who are saying that, Tish James, she ran on, I'm going after Trump. Yes, she talked about holding accountable. But I think what's also here, she's now applying pressure to Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who pulled back on the investigation into Trump, basically by saying, hey, player, what you gonna do? And so now by saying to the U.S. attorneys, we uncovered criminal wrongdoing. Here's a referral. And she's saying, I'm going to hand you the evidence. Now what you're going to do. And so now Merrick Garland, now Bragg, now they're going to have to now contend with this and then the pressure's on them by saying, are you going to let him escape?
Right. Well, I mean, she's made criminal referrals, and one of the prior investigations went stale, and now it gets another life, and that is good. She had access to information, and they obviously did a deep dive in order to come up with the strength of the filing that went forward today. So I commend the AG, Tish James. Gotta say, that's a bison. That's a Howard lawyer for you, and a Black woman, and every good thing. So I support her and the work that she is doing. And it's not like AG Garland is not doing probably 10 other investigations of the former president. But yes, this referral with everything that they have uncovered and the meticulous manner in which it's been put together certainly cannot hurt.
The thing also here, I think, as I sat there and listened to her this morning, and again, this 22-minute opening statement that we played, was that she was so specific in naming this property, this property, this property, Mar-a-Lago, this. Now, okay, sure, you got the Trump folks already out here. You got his defenders. They're now going to have to try to defend lies. In fact, I saw a tweet earlier from Geraldo Rivera who goes, oh, well, this was partisan. And she claimed the Mar-a-Lago is worth this, but it's really worth way more than that. That's not how it works, Geraldo. The reality is this. When she said Mar-a-Lago brought in essentially $25 million in revenue. Well, we know how the game works. Certain businesses, there's a multiple. There's a multiple. If you did $25 million in the media business, typically you can use a multiple of 10, $250 million. This dude was actually trying to say Mar-a-Lago was worth $750 million. And the thing that we also know, Robert, is that what he was doing was when it benefited him to lower the value for tax purposes, he did. But then he would raise the value when it came to getting loans, the exact same property. And that's also, they have that information.
It was quite the stunning dichotomy that we saw earlier today, because I was doing what I think a lot of people were doing the picture-in-picture, where you have Joe Biden's speech to the UN on one screen and then Tish James's presentation on Donald Trump on the other screen. So on the one hand, you have President Biden addressing the world leaders, condemning Russia on their invasion of Ukraine, speaking up on the fact that we need to have African, Central American, South American nations on the UN Permanent Security Council so that the larger nations can no longer use their veto power to subjugate the remainder of the world. It was a very important speech, one of the most significant speeches in front of the UN that any president has ever given. At the same time, you have the other president being credibly accused and detailed point by point every crime that he has committed in connection with this investigation, not to mention the entire scroll of other crimes that Sean Hannity put up a few days ago. And the fact that nearly 40% of this country will still get in line behind the person who did all the crimes and not the one who is trying to reestablish the rule-based authority of law to stop totalitarianism, to tell you exactly where this nation rests at. Donald Trump comes from a long line of hustlers. His dad was a fraud. His granddad was a pimp. We know what this family does. They make their money through corrupt bargains. And I think as opposed to this being the end of the Trump family corruption, this is just the opportunity for them to transition it. They're going to transition it from being New York real estate-based fraud now to being conservative media-based fraud. And that will be the new bread and butter of the Trump empire. People will continue sending them money. They'll buy my pillows from them. They'll send money to build the wall that will never get built, and they'll keep the crime syndicate going because that's what criminal organizations do. And hopefully at some point in time, once these individuals start getting, because more than likely the Trump organization will try to settle this suit against them. I think they said they were seeking $250 million in damages from the Trump organization. They will try to settle that for some amount thereunder. What will happen with the federal investigation, criminal investigation thereafter, will be the major question. But they will take that. They will say that this is part of the continued liberal fraud against them, and they will keep hustling their people for money. It's never been about elections. It's never been about winning or losing. It's about continuing the grift, continuing the hustle, and that's what we've seen the Trump family do for now 4 generations.
Larry, again, this is another investigation. It is about holding accountable. And I've said this to people over and over again. There is no bottom. There is none. Okay. And at some point, when you are this much of a thug, when you're rogue, someone has to hold you accountable. And the reality is, whether it's this civil suit, Trump tried to settle this suit. They knew she had the goods. She's like, nah, we good. Nah, we good. And so she's got significant leverage in this case. Donald Trump does not want this to go to trial. That's why he has fought tooth and nail against Congress trying to get his tax returns, against Tish James, against the Manhattan's DA office, because he knows when you open up the financial records, they are going to see this is nothing but a fake, trash empire, so-called empire built on sand, quicksand.
Roland, he's been getting away with this for decades. He's finally being held accountable. And that's why today is so important. And listen, the bottom line is, and obviously you talked about, the Trump and his colleagues, his friends and supporters accusing A.G. James of partisanship. He better be nice because she's got the goods on him. And that's just the bottom line. And they're going to have to settle. Like you said, Roland, they can't afford for this to go to court. But he's stuck. And I want to make a connection to politics for a second here. This is one of the reasons why he wants to run in 2024. He only solely cares about being president of the United States to kind of feel like he can get some kind of cover and have certainly have some control and power. But the bottom line is, with all these lawsuits, certainly this most recent one today, but all the other challenges you've unpacked on your show, he's in a lot of trouble. And my colleague mentioned the My Pillow guy, but I think that he should create a pillow for Trump that says it's a wrap, because I don't see how he can navigate himself out of this particular challenge, the civil suit. And like I said, it's going to the IRS and DOJ. So who knows in terms of the long-term consequences, not only for him, but in terms of his children also. And I really quickly, Roland, I'm going to talk about the comments you referred to Barr made earlier today. And once again, like I said, when it comes to how Black folks are treated when they commit minor infractions or none compared to how powerful white people were treated. And once again, we see an example of that kind of language that is used to compare powerful adults to, even Black children who are just walking down the street, how they're treated by law enforcement and the government. So once again, we see how racism works in this country when it comes to race and power.
Monique, I listen to these folks talk about, oh, my God, this is so partisan. Well, that was a certain gentleman who was a Democrat in Texas. He was the attorney general, okay? And he was a rising star, Latino. He was conservative, and they were loving him. He was the attorney general when George W. Bush was the governor. And folks were just, oh, my goodness. I mean, he is going to be the man. He's going to be the man. Well, he got himself caught up trying to hook up a lawyer to get a piece of the tobacco settlement. But people forget, when Dan Morelos went to prison for 4 years, because he also filled out applications and he overstated his income in trying to get cars and houses. The moment he signed that document, that was a federal offense. And he went to prison for 4 years. He was the attorney general of Texas. So it was a 4-year investigation. So for all these people who say, that's what people do. They inflate their income. Okay. But if you get caught, it's going to be some problems. And what did Tish James say today? Deutsche Bank, they're cooperating. His accountants, they're cooperating. When you start hearing that your folks on your side are cooperating with an investigation, you might want to get a little concerned.
Yes, if he wasn't completely detached from reality, perhaps that would be the case. He likely today is more concerned about the image of it. And I think it was Maggie Haberman from the Times. I'll skip my issues with her. But
Yep, you're right.
who I believe accurately said that what happened today is the one thing that he has dreaded and tried to avoid the most, and that is a public-facing exposure of his lack of legitimacy as billionaire, as multi-millionaire, as successful businessman. That all of that was not just brought down by way of accusation, but with record after record for each and every holding. And so the ego that encompasses that man is the prevailing thoughts. We watched that through a presidency. So I don't think the notion of jail, which he would never think is reality for him, he doesn't live in a reality where that would happen, or even the notion of being without money, because he's faked all this time, having money, not having money. And it seems like, he may have been trading significant top secret government information in exchange for what? Maybe a soft landing. Who knows? But for me, looking at it, again, I applaud the effort and I believe it is necessary and that it is not partisan, in that this is the job that her office does. And when someone escapes the law for this long, they should be being held accountable. And it has nothing to do with the fact that they happen to be a Trumplican.
Well, you're right. It's about accountability. No one is above the law, whether it's a civil lawsuit, whether it's a criminal case as well. And so we'll certainly see what happens. But I think you're absolutely right. The one thing Donald Trump dreads, remember, he sued an author who said he wasn't a billionaire. He has built this facade, and that's the whole. He cares about the media attention. Well, Donald, we now know you're a liar. But then again, black people, we've known that from day one. All right, folks, back to our Roland Martin Unfiltered video in just one moment.
When we invest in ourselves, our glow, our vision, our vibe, we all shine. Together, we are black beyond measure.
Folks, Black Star Network is here.
I'm real revolutionary right now. Black power.
Support this man, Black Media. He makes sure that our stories are told.
Thank you for being the voice of Black America, Roland.
Stay black. I love y'all.
All momentum we have now, we have to keep this going.
The video looks phenomenal.
See, this difference between Black Star Network and black-owned media and something like CNN.
You can't be black-owned media and be scared.
It's time to be smart.
Bring your eyeballs home.
You dig?